Welcome back to the conversation. I'm David Schuster. There's been a lot of talk, of course, across the United States about raising the minimum wage, but there's also been an effort in some states over the past several years to actually loosen the prevailing wage laws. And what I mean by that is in certain construction states and places where there's construction work, states have generally codified what the minimum wage should be. But now, over the last 10 years or so in Indiana, West Virginia, Kentucky, Arkansas, Wisconsin, and Michigan, they actually loosened the prevailing wage laws, essentially left it up to the states and contractors to figure out in the hopes for the best. Well, how did that turn out? To talk about it is Juliana Kaplan. She's a labor and inequality reporter for Insider. Juliana, thanks for joining us. Did I get that about right? I mean, these states essentially said, okay, we're gonna get rid of the prevailing wage laws and see how things shake out. What happened?
Yeah, I would say you nailed it. So essentially prevailing wage laws, as you very accurately summarized, are setting minimum wages within jobs like construction, although actually there's sort of a trickle-down effect or trickle-out effect. Sometimes custodians and other service workers are included as well within the prevailing wage laws. And prevailing wage usually applies to government contracts. So that's why, we haven't seen the federal minimum wage go up in a long, long time. But prevailing wage laws are essentially meant to ensure that all the workers are getting paid the same rate and that people who are bidding for government contracts, so like if there's a big building being built near you, a bunch of construction companies are probably bidding because they want to get that big contract and they want to come in with the lowest bid. Prevailing wage laws are meant to make sure that they're not making that lowest bid by paying people a lot less. However,
and in these states, Indiana, Wisconsin, West Virginia, Arkansas, Michigan, this was all studied by the University of Illinois. What happened, therefore, to the construction wages in those states when the prevailing wage laws were loosened?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the animus behind rolling back these prevailing wage laws was, this will save taxpayers money. It will, make people build more. That's not what we saw happen. So we saw wages for construction workers go down in those states who would have been covered by the prevailing wage laws. We actually saw fatality rates go up among construction workers in the states where the prevailing wage laws were rolled back. And there was also a greater reliance on social safety net benefits, which in and of itself, those benefits are incredibly important. There's no shame in utilizing them. But that being said, if you're somebody with a job that had a wage level before where you wouldn't have necessarily needed to use those, if your argument is that these higher wages are a drain on taxpayers, taxpayers also subsidize those benefits. So taxpayers were still, and to a certain degree, subsidizing the wages, but just for people who are in a dire enough spot to need things like food stamps, for instance.
So they loosened the wage laws and suddenly people are getting paid less for construction work. They're less productive. They're more likely to be injured on the job and cost the taxpayers in other ways. Was this seen as a surprise, according to the researchers at the University of Illinois?
I mean, I think the researchers themselves, and economists who study this were not necessarily surprised, but it did come as a surprise to the states who did it. So I want to say in West Virginia, I believe the governor said, we rolled back this prevailing wage law and we were ready for all of the projects and all of the workers to roll in, and they never did. So yeah, there you go.
So a surprise, I mean, look, this is done by, whether it's Governor of West Virginia or other states, they do it because they think they can save taxpayers money. It turns out that it makes the workers certainly unhappy. Perhaps it costs the state more in other ways. So what does West Virginia do with something like this? Is there now an effort to sort of change and say, okay, we tried with the prevailing wage laws to loosen it, that didn't work, let's bring it back?
Yeah, that is a great question. I have to admit, I am not fully up to date on what each of these individual states are doing, but I think that the appetite to bring in a new regulation is not necessarily always high. Although that being said, I would be curious to see how, if legislation was brought to a vote, how that would go, because we have seen historically right-leaning states vote to increase their minimum wages overall. So I think if it were something that people were to weigh in on, you might see a different type of result. But I think also right now, some of the messaging that went behind Let's Roll Back these prevailing wage laws was a lot of this animus of, okay, like we need to be spending less on the government. We need to stop draining taxpayers. We need to get rid of these regulations. And I think we're seeing a lot of that rhetoric right now in regards to the current economy. So I'd be curious to see how it plays out.
One of the other things, as I understand it, with prevailing wage laws, it was also to sort of assure that, if you have, let's say, a minimum $25, just for argument's sake, an hour for somebody who's a construction worker, you're going to be able to get a certain amount of labor supply at that rate. Whereas if you drop the wage down to say $17, maybe there are fewer people who want to be on that particular construction project. So by keeping the wages up, it's sort of a way of making sure that whoever gets these contracts gets the construction workers and is able to fulfill these duties. Did that get hurt also, the ability to sort of accomplish this and have enough worker supply when the wage laws sort of were loosened?
Yeah, so there wasn't exact data necessarily on worker supply. What they did find was actually a smaller share of project money was going to in-state projects. So, make of that what you will. But in terms of the impact that prevailing wage law does have on worker supply, the same researchers actually looked at this through the lens of custodians, who I mentioned are part of those government contracts. If you are building a big building or doing, government work, you're gonna need people to clean up. And so a lot of states have prevailing wage laws that apply to custodians on those jobs. And they found that custodians in states with prevailing wage laws, they were much more likely to stick around. They were much easier to hire. They were not dealing with labor shortages. And this is one reason that the researchers actually contend that if you want to fight a labor shortage, you should enact prevailing wage laws. So we've seen it go the other way. When you enact prevailing wage laws, you do not have as much of an issue with worker supply. The workers are better compensated, they'll stick around for longer. And a lot of prevailing wage law too also, especially for construction workers, requires some sort of apprenticeship or training that is, in tandem with like that type of work rather than, through a private method. And that's also what the researchers attributed some of that fatality rate increasing to as well. So not only are you getting more workers more easily, to your point, but they might be better trained, or at least not hurting themselves as much.
Yeah, or with less turnover, they're going to have more experience in this particular job, and therefore perhaps safer. I'm not aware of how prevailing wage laws work in terms of the federal government. We talked about the states, but is there such a thing as a prevailing wage law when it comes to federal government contracts?
So yeah, federal contractors do have their own minimum wage, essentially, and that was actually a big move by the Biden administration. I don't know what word I was going to say. Biden administration. They raised the federal contractor minimum wage to $15 an hour. My gosh, I want to say back in 2021, but someone can fact check me on that. So that impacted a lot of workers, and not just like your typical like who you might think of as a government worker, like the aides in the White House, although I would assume they're probably making more than $15 an hour. I have not seen their paychecks. But again, coming back to like custodians and service workers, for instance, who are on federal contracts. And the Biden administration has repeatedly reiterated that they support a $15 minimum wage. If they can't do that on a federal level, they'll enact it where they can. So that was sort of the guiding decision behind raising that wage for federal contractors.
And what does this do to the overall argument? I mean, the national minimum wage remains $7.25 an hour. What does all of this do in this sort of the study from the University of Illinois about prevailing wage laws? Does it impact that debate? In other words, strengthen the hand of those who say, look, you raise wages and you actually can save money in all sorts of ways by keeping workers on the job, by having them experienced and productive and safer?
I mean, yes, people have been doing research on this since, basically like the federal minimum wage was last raised in 2009, which is now almost 14 years ago, 13 and a half. But, there's been a lot of research that has found that raising the minimum wage would not only bring millions of people out of poverty, it would disproportionately impact women and workers of color, but also in terms of what you're saying regarding savings, there's been really good research finding that raising the minimum wage would actually cost taxpayers less, because it's similarly to the prevailing wage law, people would not need to access benefits as much. And again, not saying that, benefits like SNAP or Medicaid or Medicare are bad, like it's a bad thing to access them, but ideally you're in a situation where you don't need to. And the more people who rely on those, the more everyone has to pay into those, rather than them getting a living wage and benefits through their job.
And fair to say that for a whole host of reasons, there's not much appetite at the federal level for dealing with the minimum wage. So this is really essentially a state by state battle in terms of campaigns to raise the minimum wage or to deal with prevailing wage laws.
Yeah, and it is definitely for workers in states who are impacted, who are making more, like that is a game changer for them. But that being said, what we see across the country is that many states opt not to raise their minimum wage above the federal level. And those states, which are primarily in the South, also have a much larger population of Black workers working at the minimum wage. So having this be on a state by state basis does end up with racial inequity, where Black workers doing the same job in another state are making a lot more, but just because of your geographic area, which again does happen to have a higher concentration of Black minimum wage workers, those workers are making a lot less.
And to have such a disparity obviously causes problems in and of itself. Juliana Kaplan, she is the labor and inequality reporter for Insider. Julia, thanks for diving into this for us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
You got it. And that'll do it for this edition of The Conversation. On behalf of Asher Cofield, Craig Lowry, Bart Kyle, Mark Gillespie, John DeSilva, Skip Valaco, Gina Kim, and the rest of the gang that have contributed to The Conversation. I'm David Schuster. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We will see you again somewhere soon.